give him an answer right away. I had to think about things. So I called him back the next day and said, yes, I can give you a meeting. And he was overjoyed that I would talk, and it was something that he actually wanted somebody to talk about, was the B-25, one of the planes I'll get into. And then after I got through talking with him, he said, well, I'm in the hospital and got colon cancer. And that was about all that was said on it. I didn't realize he was so bad off. Anyhow, we had the funeral today for him across the road here from the March Museum over in the National Cemetery at noon. And we had a reception right here at the museum. So the talk I'll give then, we get into it, is on pilot training. And I go by a thing of, I never throw anything away if I can avoid it. And so I went back 64 years to pilot training, 1954, and I didn't realize I had so much material I could put together and give a talk on what happened 64 years ago. So we'll get on with it. I went to college at the University of Arizona, and I was in ROTC, and the Korean War was on during the early 50s, and in my junior year, you had to go to summer camp to get your military training, and during the training, the Korean War ended. So in the senior year, the pressure was off kind of, but we still had contracts in ROTC to get commissioned and out, and I had already chosen pilot training, so the orders were already cut before I even graduated, that we'd start pilot training in July. And in the college, the military, they always say they're giving you a lot of choices to do. And when I was in college, they said, okay, you can get with your buddies that are going to pilot training, and you can pick bases, and you can all be, like 3 or 4 people can be together at the same base. And they had a pilot training base in Arizona and across the country. There were about 9 of them in Florida, so we chose Arizona and Florida. Never been to Florida, so that's something. So then when the orders came, it was none of the above. And the guys that I was working with, I never saw them again. But so here's where I went. It says, welcome to Goodfellow Air Force Base. And this was in Columbus, Mississippi. And there's still a base there, but at that time it was a primary base. And they get you piped up. This was a folder that he gave everybody, and every man's a tiger. In the days when they started pilot training for mass producing of pilots in World War II, the Korean War, they mainly took them right out of high school and did some military training, put them through pilot training, and if they made it all the way, they got commissioned. And they stopped that program in 1954. And so now all the schools were switched over, and it was all second lieutenants, so out of mainly ROTC, but they West Point and Annapolis too. A lot of people from Texas A&M. And so it was an all-officer class, so they didn't quite know how to handle that, and so we had a few conflicts. We went there and had the Goodfellow Air Base. So what they did, you start out for introductory to flight in like a Piper Cub, and you had 20 hours in the Piper Cub to solo it, and you did air work. You had to learn what a stall was and how to get out of a stall if you went into one and everything, and familiarize you with flying an airplane. And you notice that just out on the grass, they had a place that was away from the main base, like a little cow pasture, and they kept the grass cut a little bit. And they would just go out and set up a runway out there with bushel baskets, and you'd go shoot landings. So the main base was for T-6s. So they go out there and do it. And like I say, you learn what to stall. So after a few hours, they say, okay, you've got it. The instructor gets out, and you take off and go fly it. And so you're lined up in a row to get out there, and the guy that I was right behind got on the runway, or the takeoff area. I was right behind him, and he took off, and he pulled it up too fast, like you're not supposed to do, and stalled out, and went over on the wing and did a cartwheel. Then it was off the area. They just pulled the plane out of the way. He wasn't hurt. So now it was my turn to go. And everything worked out okay. This just shows all the Piper Cubs at the base where they're lined up when you get the plane and fly out to the auxiliary area. This is a photo that it shows. They had a truck with the tower, an ambulance, and a fire truck out there, and then, like I say, just a place marked by bushel baskets. And I thought that was pretty good. I took the photo. These are old cameras from the 40s, 50s, and you look down in the top to take your picture, and you just got a little window in there. And then the photos you get are about 2 by 3 or something like that, very small. And I was taking a picture, I guess, of that plane that's taken off, but I never saw it till we blew it up on the screen here, because on the little photo it's just a dot. So I did pretty good to capture that plane taking off with that type of film. So here's part of the learning process. You've never flown before, and you got to learn the language, and they have a whole checklist you go through. Of course, today it's the same thing with airliners. They got checklists they go through. So this is just the one for here. And you go through all those things before you take off, and then there's certain procedures you go to set to take off, and then after takeoff, but you climb out, the airspeeds and everything, you have to know all that stuff. And like I say, it's a whole new language and everything, so these are things you learn in pilot training. And then I said this lasted for 20 hours. So then the next step was to go into the T6. And the T6 has a 600 horse engine in it. The Piper Cub was less than 100 horse. So now you got something that's more powerful and climbs out fast. This is a plane, they made about 15,000 of them during the pilot training. There was planes before this, but starting in the 1940s and World War II, they were into this, and it was all during the 1950s. And like I said, we started a new era of an all second lieutenant class. This was an era, we were the last class to fly in the T6, because now they took the T6s and scrapped them, and they were getting into the jet age. It's 1955. And so we were in the last class. When we finished, they were flying them to Davis-Monthan. And that was the end of them, except the few that got saved here and there. It's just a picture of me, like, get an idea what the size of the plane. It was a two-seater, and it had there's a canopy that slid back and forth. But when you went to altitude, we were there in the summer, it was really hot. This 1954, there was no air conditioning in those days in buildings. And it was, 100 degrees and 80% humidity. But you go up to 5,000 feet, and it was fairly reasonable. You just fly like a convertible, just open the canopy up and fly along. And then, see, there's a protrusion out of the side of the plane which you use to step into the cockpit. And as you got into the T6, first thing you got to learn is pattern work. And this is to prepare you like when you come back to land. Everybody has a certain pattern they go through to land at the runway and everything, so you can handle a lot of planes at one time. And so you go up in the air and just, there's a, it says start here, and you start a normal cruise, and then you change to a low cruise, and you make 45-degree turns and back around, and then change your power settings again, and just practice flying, so you don't have to think about these things so much when you're actually coming in to land. So there was two different patterns we worked with here. And then we got into, in the T6, a lot of the work goes on. You're doing some navigation, and that was by what they call dead reckoning. You just had a map of the area. You had no radios. The plane didn't have navigational radios in it. And so it's like driving your car down the road. You had a map, and you looked down and recognized features of the area, highways, railroads, hills. There weren't any hills in Mississippi, but, and so you would fly from point to point. And try to keep from getting lost, the main thing. Never did. And then there's night flying, which is a challenge when you get up there in the dark. And we went through that. And then toward the end of the class, we got into aerobatic flying, and that was for the people that were going on in their pilot training to go on to fighter planes, where they have to do this. I went on to multi-engine, so I never did any more after this. Yeah, this is a pattern. The plane starts here, and they call this a lazy 8. And you go up, pull up, and hit the peak here. Your airspeed slows down, but then you start down the slope, build up your speed, and then you go up and do the other side. So you're just making a great big lazy 8 in the sky. So that was something that we did quite a bit. We were practicing, because you get both left and right turns, climbing, descending, and stuff. And then this is a loop. And you enter the loop, and you have to go into it in a dive to build the speed up so you can make it up around the top and out the bottom without stalling out. And what I have here now, 40 years later, there's a unit called the Warbirds. And the Warbirds had 4 T6s down at French Valley Airport back in 1997. This is 42 years after I had done this. And I went down, and they have flights mainly for people just to go up and fly plane first time. But I got the pilot, and he says, well, I want to do some of these like I did back then. He says, fine. And he ran me through, I forgot these airspeeds and stuff, so he ran me through, and then he let me do one each of them. And so we'll do the video now. And like I say, this is 1997. So the Warbirds also have B-17s, B-25s to fly in. They charge about $300 an hour. And the T6s were all painted yellow. It looks orange on this, but it's really yellow.
You'll be working back and forth between 140 and 80.
And this is the pilot that had the plane there talking there. And so they had a camera right in the plane, so they were taking photos the whole time. And the T6, if you say, they were all yellow. This one, they had been in the Air National Guard at one point, so that's what that ANG stands for.
Okay, let's get 140.
So what he's talking about, we're going to do one of those lazy eights. So you go down, we were flying about 120, so you're getting the plane down to go up to 140. So then when you hit 140, you're at the top and you make your turn.
Coming down to 80.
And now have made that turn. Now we're going back down to the bottom, building up our speed, and then we'll do another turn on the 8. Build the speed up. The speed's up to was up to 140. Now it's dying off, and we'll turn to the right.
Yeah. You okay? You comfortable? Oh yeah, I just said, to me, to go into that steep of banging and stuff, I thought that's a little bit of an unnatural act, but right now, okay, you got the airplane back. Okay, got it.
So he's saying, I've got it now, so I did one of these lazy eights. The visibility wasn't too good that day, so, to see the countryside.
Very nice.
So I'm flying it now.
Right on the money there.
He was testing me too, to see if I could still fly the thing, and he found out I could, so. Yeah, we're coming back down through that from the top.
Right on your 140. Yeah, 145. Looking good. Looking very nice.
There's that guy in the back seat. You see, there's not much room in there.
Now I see a little of that old second lieutenant.
This DVD computer on there will only play a minute at a time, so that's what the interruptions are.
It's a hard push there for that last 10 miles per hour, isn't it? Yeah, it is. It's really kind of strange. Okay, you step 2, get me 45. A little bit more. A little bit more about, right about there. Okay? Now go left. Push it all the way over.
See, now we're doing a roll.
Now right there we were doing just a little touch of left rudder.
Just doing a roll. So we were complete roll over and you come out. It's called a slow roll.
Okay, she might have been able to see that. You do it.
There's several different kinds of rolls. There's one where you do an 8-point. Every 45 degrees you stop. That one you just roll it over. Before you start doing a maneuver like this, you got to look around, make sure there aren't any other planes flying right around you when you go into one of these.
Okay, here we go. Look left. Look right. We'll pull just a little bit more there.
Now we're doing a loop where you go, we're going up. So you're pulling the airspeed up at the top. And you see when you hit the bottom, you're pulling several G's. That's what you see the expression on my face where the muscles are coming down. And so that's when you pull the G's when you come out of the loop. That's it. So that just to go up and fly was a good experience after 42-year absence, and that was enough. So after we had all the flight training in the T6, 120 hours, They also had what they call link trainers. That was just a black box that would move in a circle or up and down a little bit to simulate flight. And we had 20 hours in that. And then we graduated after 6 months in January, and then we moved on to what they call basic training. We were in primary. And again, the class started out in the primary, it was about 140 people, and it was down to 100 time we graduated. Most of them had gone out the first couple of weeks. They just had no ambition to fly, really. They took the commission, or air sickness, too, was a big one. That some people would get sick every time they get in the plane, just about. Various things happened. But anyhow, there was 100. And what they did, they divided the class 50-50 so that half would go to multi-engine, the B-25 that you see here, and the other half would go to jets, the T-33, which was out then. And in the early days of jet training, they were losing a lot of people between all the flight bases. So, and I didn't mention, but see, we were all out of college together, all graduated at the same time, all got married at the same time on graduation, just about. The whole class had wives, and the wives didn't particularly want their husbands to go to jet training because of the reputation of it. And so, in the past, when they had cadet training, the cadets couldn't wait to get into fighter aircraft. It wasn't jet then, but that's what they wanted to do. So they would only take the top half of the class academically, the ones that scored the best. Now they got a class that nobody wanted to go to jets. And that they couldn't, they couldn't believe this was happening and didn't know what to do to solve the problem until somebody came up with, they had everybody put their ID card in a cardboard box, and the first 50 they drew out got their choice. In other words, got to go to B-25s. And of the 50 that went to the jet training, within a year, 5 of them had died already. So the statistics were valid, what they said. So anyhow, this is the B-25. It was used in World War II as a bomber. And it got its most notoriety when Doolittle trained a bunch of, about 20 plane crews to fly off the aircraft carrier. So the Hornet went toward Japan. And when they got so far out, they wanted to get a little closer, but they thought they'd been seen. So they launched the 20 planes for Japan, and they went and bombed. And the main thing was that they didn't really do that much damage, but it shook the Japanese up that the American planes were bombing their country. And the plan was then the B-25s were to fly to China, but they were low on fuel at that point, and it was storming and raining, and so they ditched planes everywhere. Amazingly, that over 50% of them lived through it, the crews that were on that. But the B-25 has 2 engines. They're 2,600 horsepower. And it has a double tail in the back. So it's rather unique. Here at March, they have a B-25 that's parked out there beyond the other hangar over there. It used to be right here in front by the walkway. That and the T-6 I was just showing. But now they're relegated to another area. They made 10,000 of these. And they flew mainly in the Pacific. There was some that flew in North Africa to Italy, but the main thrust was in the Pacific and Indochina, Burma to China. And they gave 892, 900 went to Russia. another 900 went to Great Britain, and other countries got these. And so it wasn't really not like the B-17 or B-24 where there were thousands of them in Europe, but it was used a lot. And then after World War II ended, they stripped the plane down, took all the armament off, and made it a training plane. So it's called a TB-25 now. T for training, bomber 25. And so it was used in pilot training. But again, we were one of the last classes in B-25s because it was going to jets. So soon after, everybody got trained in jets. But we were the experimental class kind of going through all this. I put this map in just to show you, like we did the Dead Reckoning. And this is a map right here of Southern California. March Air Base is right in here. There's Lake Elsinore right over here, so March would be right about here. But you see, and you can't see the lines real well, but there's contour lines, so you know, by reading the contour lines, you know exactly how high these mountains are, and you can see different features. So this is what, when you navigated then, the basic was just Dead Reckoning. Again, this is 1954. And then the B-25 did have a couple of navigational, so we learned to fly by radios too, and that. One of the things, and if people had to figure this out now, it would blow their mind probably, because this is a radial range. They had one right out here at the end of the runway at March where Alessandro and 215 come together. And it's called a radial range. And it puts out a signal, and they can move those lines. They have a tower in the middle and 4 other towers. And where they set up the 4th tower, like they could have a just 30-degree angle in there if they wanted to. But they broadcast an A and an M. So and that was something else we had to learn, even in primary. We had to learn Morse code, because then everything was in Morse code, the identifiers for the radios and all that. So we had to know Morse code, and we had to know the phonetic alphabet, which was new to me. But the thing of the radio range, it had a broadcast an N in one quadrant, and then an N over in this quadrant. An A is did or a dot and a dash, and an N is a dot, or a dash and a dot. So when you put the two together on this line, they overlap and you get a solid signal. So if you're flying along over here and you're hearing an N, an N, and then a line, and then you go in here and you're hearing an A, you know you've gone through this. This is what this is. If you went up here and you're making a traffic pattern or something to go around. But it was all done in the headset, just listening to the code and stuff. And you see the radio station, this was Lubbock, but it's identified. Riverside was, and I heard that so much, it's RIB. So it did-ah, did-it-da, did-ah, did-it-da, RIB. Nowadays, they got GPS. You can't even imagine using something like that anymore. Again, this probably went out by 1960, that system. And something that we didn't do in T6s, but B-25s, we practice formation flying, because bombers fly formation, and so do cargo planes that are doing troop drop fly formation. So we just use the basic 3. So you have to learn points on the plane if you're on the wing, and what to look for. You have certain parts, so that if it just changes a little bit, you know you've got to do something to keep up or slow down. And you also have to be aware, if you get up too high, you get in the prop wash of the plane leading, it puts you out of control. About the only thing you can do is pull the power off and drop out and come back in again. Even in jets, they don't get the prop wash, but they have the turbulence that the plane and the jet engine do. So, formation flying is quite a thing. I did a talk here just last year on the C-119, and we did right here at March, in the 452nd, we did formation flying down in the Salton Sea area, south by Central, and they dropped troops or cargo out of the plane, and we were flying formation. And that's probably the most difficult in the summer, when the heat waves are coming up, different, whether it's green farm field or bare farm field, and the planes are going like this. We were only 1,000 feet above the ground when we were flying these. And Nancy, here's your picture. Nancy, there's your picture up there. She's on the left. I didn't take any pictures when I was in pilot training here on B-25s, and I had this newspaper article that we cut out. And like I said, that we were all second lieutenants with new wives. So the officers club, when we were the primary base in Mississippi, they didn't have it. That was a civilian base that contracted to the Air Force. But here we're on a regular military base. So the officers' wives club had to figure out how to entertain all these young brides and everything. So, and one of the days they took them on a tour of the base and the plane. So there's the B-25 tail in the background. And here's what I said, I call it a link trainer. You notice right here they call it a synthetic trainer. Now it's called a simulator. But in those days, you see, it's just a small box right here. That's it. And you sat in there, and then they closed everything up, and there were instruments, so you could fly, and you get the movement. It would swivel and rock and do different things, and that was about it. Nothing like a simulator today. A simulator today, they can make it, well, you can simulate emergencies too. There was nothing for emergencies, but when you fly one, you feel like you're in the actual plane. It's that real. And you can even come in and land, and they have video of the airport you're landing at, so it's the real thing almost. But this is the old days. There's the side of the plane there then. Okay, and we didn't get, yeah, I did. The guy there with the cap on his name. Gives you a relative idea how big the plane is, and that's our class. And the ones in these uniforms were the administrative part, and these were the instructors here in the front row. So if it was in color, there'd be different colors, but everything was black and white then. So after another 120 hours of flying the B-25, the way they worked it, they would have half the class go to ground school in the morning from 8 to 12, and then the other half of the class would be flying on the flight line. And then it would switch after a month, so you get both morning and night, but you flew half the day and you ground school half the day. But when I'm saying flying, each flight instructor had at least 3 students. So if he took one, like in the T6, if he took a student up, The other two are just sitting there waiting for the plane to come back for their turn. And to go through the procedure, that takes a half a day to go through all that. The B-25, you could all fly on the same plane at least, but it's still, considering it was 6 months and you only get 120 hours, that's not very much airtime. But anyhow, after all that, we finally graduated, became pilots, and you get out, and again, everybody had a wife to tend the wings on. When they had the cadets, I don't know, I'm not sure what they did, but that's the thing, was the wife tends the wings on. This is the old tan uniform that the Air Force had in 1954. And they said, you got to have one of those for graduation. So I went and bought this uniform, and I wore it for graduation, and it never was worn again, because we went up, I was stationed in Spokane, Washington, and they wore blues up there all the time. Besides, I think they did away with that by about 56 or so. So we can donate that to the museum. And then the same thing, we graduated. Again, the decision, where are you people going now? And Strategic Air Command had B-36s in those days. And the SAC always wanted a third pilot, but there were never enough pilots coming out of pilot training for them to fill that order. So now the war was over in Korea, and all of a sudden there's pilots. So we had our choice of a B-36 base in Washington or Puerto Rico. And again, it wasn't a wife, it was a wife's choice, because in Puerto Rico in 1954, the communist effort was going strong. They had tried to assassinate the President of the United States on the White House, or not the Capitol steps, and the base was on lockdown, so no dependents were allowed in Puerto Rico. So that was an easy choice again, go to Spokane. And this time they took the top half of the class, said, okay, you can go where you want. And luckily I was in the top half. Actually, the whole crisis ended in about 3 or 4 months after we graduated from Aerobic. So that's a little background on flying 3 planes, which are similar, or the T-6s here and the B-25 here at the airport. And again, talking about Oscar, he wanted to see the B-25 up here. And didn't quite make it. I wished he could have. That concludes my talk.